So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm starting out this session by just welcoming everybody to our International Symposium on Economics and Livelihoods after COVID-19. So this is a collaborative effort between the International Society for Ecological Economics and Research and Degrowth, or essentially the International Degrowth Community. And so these are two organizations, two groups with broadly shared worldviews. We both understand that the economy is a subsystem of a global ecosystem on a finite planet. We have broadly shared goals for a just and sustainable future. We have shared intellectual origins. So Georgescu-Roegen is considered one of the pioneers of ecological economics, and also his work was translated into French, I believe, is degrowth. And Joan Martinez-Alier is also one of the intellectual founders of ecological economics and the degrowth movement. So there's a shared recognition between these two societies that business as usual, continuing our current path of endless economic growth, using more fossil fuels and more resources to have greater consumption, threatens radical changes to ecological life support functions at a global scale. We have a shared reluctance between these two societies to just bet the future on unpredictable technological breakthroughs that will miraculously give us a new technology to address our ecological challenges. Both societies, both organizations prefer to really pursue intentional, but almost certainly radical changes to our economic and social systems to avoid those radical changes to our ecosystems. Which really means that we're in this predicament of radical change is almost inevitable, either if we do nothing or if we act vigorously to prevent the radical ecological changes. We also come from a position of shared ignorance. Neither ecological economist nor the degrowth movement knows how to bring about the desired changes we so desperately need. If we knew, we would have already done so. Part of this conference is to pool our resources to try to figure out how to move forward towards this just and sustainable future together. While there's a lot of areas of agreement between the societies or these organizations, there's also a lot of disagreement, both within each community and across the different communities. And this conference will help explore those changes as well, or those differences as well. So already we're facing radical change in the form of COVID-19. This has disrupted previous economic and social trajectories. So most immediately, this has forced us to originally had a conference plan for this state, and we've had a transition to a symposium, a virtual symposium. We invite you to come to our conference next July that probably as a result of COVID will also be largely virtual. And that could be a long-lasting change in conferences. But most importantly, what COVID has done, it's really shown a harsh spotlight on social and economic inequities and inefficiencies in our society. And this is resulting in increasing calls for fundamental changes to our system. You know, across the world, we've seen these huge eruptions of social movements and protests and awareness of the inequities of billionaires increasing their wealth by 20% as 40 million people become unemployed in the US alone. So this symposium is really designed to explore these issues in greater detail. So individual sessions, beginning with this one, will look at the potential for an alliance between ecological economics and degrowth. Further sessions are going to look at the deeply unequal impacts on lives and livelihoods and well-being across race, gender, and class. One of the central aims of this symposium has been to draw on a range of voices across race, ethnicity, class, and gender to really give expression to the many views out there. We want to explore new possibilities for building alternative livelihoods and economies that can take us beyond this growth obsession with capitalist and socialist economies alike. We really need to focus on making change happen. How do we take our academic ideas and use them to transform the world, which in my view is what all social scientists are actually trying to do. The final day is going to explore the role of art and activism in all of this. And I think many of us here, and including me, you know, we're suffering through these terrible times of COVID right now, but I really hope that 20 years from now, we're going to look back at COVID and see the pandemic as a turning point that launched us towards a more just and sustainable future, so that there could be this silver lining to COVID. And finally, I want to thank the Political Economy Center at the University of Manchester for hosting this event and the local organizing committee for a tremendous amount of hard work. It's hard to exaggerate how much effort they put into this. And it's, this is a free conference. This was done essentially by volunteer activity, volunteer time, for the benefit of pushing this agenda. So with that, I think I will turn the microphone over to Federico, who will introduce the rationale behind this session.
Thanks, Josh, and hi, everyone, and thanks to the organizer. So the idea behind this session, it was really that we're trying to bring together these two communities, degrowth and ecological economics, but we didn't wanted to give it for granted that there should be an alliance between the two, so that we put together this dialogue with different speakers, with different opinion to discuss a little bit the issue. Before we start, I just wanted to try and give some clarification also to break the ice and wait while more people are joining. So I'm going to briefly address the question of what are degrowth and ecological economics, what do they aim for, what are some of the differences and similarities they have, and see how this can create eventually a potential for an alliance. So starting with what they are, ecological economics was born in the late 1980s and is an interdisciplinary field concerned with the relationship between the environment and the economy. The International Society for Ecological Economics and the journal Ecological Economics were founded in 1989. Since then, there have been 16 international conferences, and here we are. Degrowth instead is much more recent and somehow could be seen as a daughter of ecological economics. It was born as an activist slogan in France at the beginning of the year 2000, and it has become a concept debated in academia, a frame for a social movement, and some would even argue a political ideology on an emerging scientific paradigm. So in this sense, it's not exactly a discipline like ecological economics, but it has become influence. It has become an influence in different disciplines like anthropology, geography, of course, ecological economics, political ecology, etc. The first International Degrowth Conference in English took place in 2008, so about 10 years ago. And since then, there have been 7 international conferences, all in Europe, only with 2 exceptions, one in Montreal and in Mexico City. So we see that they are similar, but with some differences already. But important for this session is what do they aim for? What are these goals? Well, I think broadly speaking, we could say that both aim to promote human well-being, sustainability, and justice. So in this sense, I think we can claim that they have at least broadly shared goals. Then what they might differ is on how to achieve these goals, both between degrowth and ecological economics, and of course also within these two communities, there are different opinions. They are not definitely not homogeneous. So now, just to point out some of the differences and similarities between the two. Well, ecological economics is clearly a discipline. Of course, it's interdisciplinary, but it has a clear focus on economics, while degrowth is much more diffuse. It has a growing influence in different disciplines, but it's more like an idea, a concept that wants to transform society. Academically speaking, in terms of scientific publication, ecological economists may mainly publish in the journal Ecological Economics, while degrowth scholars have published in different journals from different disciplines. There have been more than 10 special issues. And for example, only this year there will be 5 books. So you see that ecological economics has a long tradition of 3 decades, while degrowth is much more recent, but very lively. They have also a different degree of institutionalization because ecological economics has a well-established international and regional societies. There is a well-established journal also with a lot of prestige in academia. There are professors of ecological economics, there are university degrees, research centers, and etc. Instead, degrowth is organized around a loose international network. Of course, there are summer schools. There is a first master degree on degrowth here in Barcelona. There are debates for having a new journal, but there is a clear difference here in the level of institutionalization between the two. I think also, frankly, that there is a difference in the geographical focus because ecological economics is clearly international, although I think it's stronger in the global north, while degrowth was born in Europe, and it thinks of the global north, and it has no ambition to be exported to the global south. Instead, it wants to create an alliance with other alternatives to development, like Buen Vivir in Latin America or Ubuntu in South Africa. Then I think one of the things that brings together the two communities is that they have an interesting similar debates, although they often have different takes. So debates on dematerialization, on the role of markets, or indicators, on ecological macroeconomics, etc. On this, I think we will enter into the details during the dialogue. Only on the issue of development, let me say, I think that while degrowth takes an explicit stand that is critical towards development, development is seen as a Western cultural construct that has been imposed upon other countries in the global South. I think ecological economists see development as something good, or at least they would accept the idea of sustainable development. And then last, and I think this is difficult to evaluate, we could discuss what has been the degree of influence in academia, media, social movements, and policy making of both ecological economics and degrowth. Degrowth is much more recent, but at least in Europe, it has gained a lot of attention in the last 10 years. For example, I could mention in 2018, on the occasion of a conference in the European Parliament on degrowth, there was a petition asking the European institution to implement degrowth, if you want, and it was signed by over 200 scientists and supported by almost 100,000 citizens. So you see that it is an idea that is gaining terrain. These were some of the ideas I wanted to give to break the ice. And now the question is what potential for an alliance, and welcome everybody to this dialogue. And I give back the word to Josh, who is going to give a few direction of how we want to run together this dialogue. Thank you.
And before actually turning to the logistics of this, I want to say one more additional thing is that ecological economics has been around for about 30 years. In that time, most of the ecological and social issues we were founded to address have grown worse. So the next 30 years, we can't afford that. So this is a question here in this immediate session about an alliance between ecological economics and degrowth. But by implication, we're really talking about building stronger alliances with the many like-minded organizations striving to achieve these similar goals. And the question is, should these like-minded societies each go it alone against the dominant ideology of endless economic growth, or is there strength in unity? Should we join forces? So that's the bigger picture of what we're looking at today. So how this session is going to work, first of all, I'd like to ask all participants to mute their microphones. They should be muted by default, but if it doesn't work, please mute your microphones. This is really for the panelists. And I encourage you, the Zoom chat is to be used for questions and for brief comments on your views on an alliance, how it might work, whether we should have one, what would strengthen it. Federico and I will go over the chats as they come, so please post your questions as you have them. Don't wait till the end of the session. We'll have, so there will be a 5-minute, the way the session works is there'll be a 5-minute overview of the topics by each panelist, starting with degrowth ecological economics, degrowth ecological economics. And we really request people show their mutual respect by not exceeding their time slots. We'll be strict on that. And after that, the speakers will have about 3 minutes to respond to each other. This whole time, we hope that the audience will be writing questions. If you have a question for a particular participant, please put their name in capitals so we know who to address it to. Write your questions throughout the session. And with that, I will turn it back to Federico to introduce our first.
Yes, here we go. So let me introduce the first degrowth speaker, so to say. Ekaterina Chervoskaya is a researcher based at Lund University working on degrowth and critical organization studies. She co-edited the book Towards a Political Economy of Degrowth, and she co-organized the 6th International Degrowth Conference in Malmö. Plus, she is also part of the editorial collective of the Ephemera Journal. Katya, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. So I'm speaking here from a degrowth stance, but actually, my background is in economics. So quite a while ago now, I studied my bachelor's in economics, which was extremely alienating. So for 4 years, I was shifting curves, counting equilibrium points, and not being able to question the very problematic assumptions of mainstream economics. And then I didn't really want to continue in this direction. So during my master's and PhD years, I got more into critical social sciences, engaging with critical social theories, and finding it extremely fascinating. And then it's only during my postdoc years, in fact, that I came across degrowth. And that was a revelation, because I could see how it combines critique of our societies with this informed search for alternatives. And then how surprised I was to see that degrowth was actually very much informed by this field of ecological economics that I had never heard of before during my studies in economics. And I thought, wow, this is what economics should really look like. So I would like to say that definitely ecological economics has this huge contribution to rethinking economics, which is what we need. And also it has contributed a lot to research on degrowth. So in particular, I think ecological economics and the tools and frameworks developed within this field have been important in arguing for the biophysical limits to growth, which has continued into the work, say, on decoupling, problematizing the decoupling hypothesis, which is key to the green growth idea. So, and I think this is a really strong direction within degrowth research and a pillar of degrowth. However, I would also like to say, as it has already been introduced, that even if connected, degrowth and ecological economics are not really the same. So degrowth goes beyond economics, and it is a critique of not only growth, but development, aligning with the discussion on alternatives to development. And it is also a critique of capitalism as a system that is rooted in exploitation and environmental degradation. And these explicit political stances that are key to degrowth, I am not aware of the same being the case for the discipline of ecological economics. And perhaps this is the kind of outcome of this multidisciplinary discussion within degrowth, and that also over the years, degrowthers have been pushed to articulate their stances more clearly by various critical social theories, such as eco-socialism. So also, I would like to say that there are some kind of positions within ecological economics that I have come across that I have found kind of disturbing from a degrowth perspective. So one is on population growth. For example, economists like Herman Daly and also others have articulated population growth being a problem, which for me is deeply problematic because it kind of positions the sheer number of people in the world as a problem rather than the system which is built on overproduction, overconsumption and waste, and also the huge differences in which different parts of the world and different groups in society have contributed to the multiple crises that we are facing. So another discussion is on ecosystem services, much of which, or quite a bit of which, is very much shaped around the neoliberal discussion on kind of money or payment for ecosystem services or offsetting or things like this. So, and they are presenting what is the problem as a solution. So also something that I find problematic from a degrowth stance, and hence I think it is important not to reproduce these stances within degrowth. But of course, it's important to say that not everyone in ecological economics says these things, so it is only part of the discussion. So, and overall, so having said this, having brought the compatibilities and also some differences between ecological economics and degrowth, I think that definitely we should go forward together. So we should join forces, and there are many connections to build on. So we should do it by engaging in a critical dialogue between the two, and I hope also that this event and the Manchester conference next year will contribute to this dialogue and alliance building. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katya. Josh?
All right, so my great pleasure to introduce Bina Agarwal. She's a professor of development economics and the environment at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. Among her many other accomplishments, she was a former president of the International Society for Ecological Economics and the International Society for Feminist Economics. She served on many academic national and international advisory bodies. She's a prolific, original, and highly influential scholar, including award-winning books. Her most recent book is Gender Challenges, a 3-volume compendium of selected papers, and plenty more available on the website for her biography. I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Federico, John, and everybody else who's organized this conference. Let me speak, take the hat of an ecological economist from the global south. And here I see both points of divergence and convergence with degrowth, which of course itself is very diverse in thinking. Now on divergence, suppose we consider the question, can we reduce poverty without growth? Now, between 1990 and 2015, over 1 billion people moved out of extreme poverty globally, and poverty incidence fell from 36% to 10%. And the single most important factor linked to this decline was economic growth, especially in China and India. Now, under COVID-19, of course, we've seen growth rates crash globally, and linked to this, something like 71 million plus people are projected to enter extreme poverty in 2020. Some predict double that number. So most development economists and policymakers tend to see economic growth as a necessary, if not a sufficient condition for reducing poverty. Now, I know there's been an argument in degrowth that it's primarily originates and directed at the global north. But in my view, in the global south cannot be insulated from the effects of economic shrinkage in the global north, given our interlinkages in value chains, in trade, in markets, and so on. And growth in the global south has been, to a large part, also export-led in recent decades. So if the Western economies shrink, so will most low-income countries, leading back into high poverty. So this underlines my concern with aspects of degrowth. However, there is, of course, widespread recognition globally that GDP is a deeply flawed matrix. It does not measure human well-being and the environmental cost of growth pathways, nor does it cover systemic inequalities of class, gender, race, and caste. So the question is, can we grow in ways that protect the environment, reduce inequalities, create jobs, and improve human well-being? Can we protect our forests, soils, waters, air, and biodiversity? Can we reduce carbon emissions? Can communities and countries cooperate to build sustainable futures? And I believe these questions are common to both ecological economics and degrowth, and so there is considerable convergence. But then we come to the answers, and the answers, in my view, lie not in shrinking the economy, but in transforming it. We need to change what we produce, how we produce it, and how we distribute what we produce. So take the farm sector in India as an example. Now, in the 1970s, the Green Revolution model based on high-yielding variety seeds, chemical fertilizers, and assured water supply raised India's food grain production from 95 million tons in 1960 to 190 million tons in 1990. But it was totally unsustainable, because what you find is that farmers moved from multi-crops to monoculture. We exhausted our groundwater, we destroyed our soils, we polluted our rivers. And on top of that, of course, we are dealing with climate change. So then the big question is, what can be done? Answers, in my view, lie in transforming the way we farm, if we are talking about the farm sector. So technically, we do need to adopt agroecology, reduce groundwater use, create rainwater harvesting systems through community cooperation, conserve land. But we also need institutional innovation in terms of cooperation between farmers. So consider that 84% of farmers across 111 countries today cultivate less than 2 hectares, and most are non-viable. But what if farmers pooled their land, labor, and capital in small groups? They could be transformed. Now, in my own research over the past recent years, I found that in the Indian state of Kerala, all women group farms cultivating largely organically were 1.8 times more productive and 5 times more profitable than individual family farms. Kerala today has 68,000 group farms involving 300,000 women. And during COVID lockdowns, interestingly, 87% of the groups farming this March survived economically. In fact, agriculture is the only sector with positive growth in India today. So if you take this scenario, which embraces agroecology, resource conservation, renewable energy, agro-industry linkages, built on cooperation, I do believe there is a clear convergence between the visions of ecological economics and many degrowthers. But the pathway we need to ask is not perhaps shrinking growth, but in changing its trajectory. We do need to grow within the planetary boundaries. We do need to protect the planet. And I think there is agreement on that. But I want to end by saying that there are issues of inequality which I believe neither ecological economics nor degrowth have so far provided answers. And these are structural inequalities of class, gender, and race. And I believe these are real challenges in both because they impinge very strongly back into our common shared agenda, which is living and growing within planetary boundaries and protecting the planet. And so I put this forward as a challenge that both need to have greater dialogue on as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bina, for your thoughts. And now let me introduce the second so-called degrowth speaker, Ksenia Anasek, who is a researcher at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology here in Barcelona, and is a member of the Environmental Justice Project. She's the co-author of a recent article in Ecological Economics called Ecological Economics and Degrowth, Proposing a Future Research Agenda from the Margins. Ksenia, you have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. As you said, Fede, I'm going to talk about the alliance between degrowth and ecological economics from the margins. That is a result of a collective work at ICTA URB and a part of the special issue to set a new research agenda of ecological economics. And it was an idea that surged in the last Ecological Economic Conference in Mexico. So alliance between ecological economics and degrowth would help communities to achieve their shared goals for a better future, because the agenda has made an important contribution to understanding the limits of growth and exploring alternative economic, social, and ecological grassroots arrangements for living without growth. However, we argue here that a research agenda from the margins, and that is from the point of view of groups exploited within the growth economy, is urgently needed. And the agenda can integrate a plurality of genders, ethnicities, cultural and non-material relationships people for the environment, contributing thereby to social, economic and environmental well-being, equity and justice. So for a better ecological economy and the growth future in our current context with the multiple crises of health, society, economy, as well as the call for racial justice, the alliance is in the interest of the groups to actively shape a social economic transformation toward a system that is not based only on economic growth. So we, for example, reflect on the progressive environmental policies and movements for such policies, which require engaging further with the work of scholars, but also scholars, activists from the regional and international peripheries that we call the Global South, or the South in the North. Then next development and North-South relations and the recognition of historical binaries between modernity, development, and underdevelopment, as well the rich and the poor, because underdevelopment and therefore dependency is not a national isolated phenomenon, but the result of the unequal relation established with the current centers of global markets. So a dialogue between different eco-civilizations is essential for an effective politics of a real transformation. As well, to shift the attention of centers of accumulation and consumption and the extraction of labor and the resources from regional and international peripheries. So the ecological economics and the growth agenda can link unsustainable modes of living by transnational elites and the global middle class and the poor, in the terms of unequal exchange, cost shifting, environmental degradation, resources extraction, interweave with the social injustices in the periphery. that still sustain colonial relations in the so-called post-colonial era. We also reflected in the role of women in reproductive labor, slave labor, migrant labor, labor in the global south, or the work of the unemployed and their contribution to the economy of capitalism. So we said that ecological economics and the growth work sharing proposal must be designed in a gender sensitive way. For example, mechanisms and causes of the issues and the way to avoid it, and by supporting alternative collectives through the collective and participatory research and production of knowledge we all do towards a social, environmental, and economic justice. And my last point is that by supporting communities on the ground, these and many other crucial transformations towards sustainability, equity, and decolonial justice must not only be made for the South, but answered and decided together from the South and from the South itself, telling their own stories and theorizing and implementing their own alternatives to extractive capitalism, which is interrelated with patriarchy, colonialism, racism, classism, and other forms of oppression. So thank you very much, and I hope the arguments will help to carry forward our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ksenia.
Thanks very much, Ksenia. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Julia Steinberger. So she researches the resource requirements of well-being at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. She's interested in identifying the alternative development pathways to guide the necessary transition to a low-carbon society. She's a recipient of a Livelihoods Research Leadership Award for her research project investigating how universal human well-being might be achieved within planetary boundaries. And she's a lead author of the IPCC's 6th assessment report with Working Group 3. And I turn the floor over to you, Julia.
Thanks. So I support a lot. So thanks for organizing this. I think it's very interesting, and I'm going to keep my points brief, partly because I support a lot of what has been said, including the importance of degrowth in raising the issue of capitalism and political economy, and also problematizing some of the initiatives of ecological economics, which took a bit too much of the baggage of economics with them in some cases. But I also want to support and highlight what Bina was talking about. So one of the main things I wanted to bring to this conversation is that we really have to, when we're considering the intersection of ecological economics and degrowth, one of the things that we can agree on is that we need to degrow certain parts of the economy and certain factors of the economy, like anything to do with greenhouse gas emissions or deforestation, destruction of biodiversity, and so on. So there are certain parts of the economy. For instance, I'm looking now out onto a motorway, and I know my work will be done when that motorway is turned into entirely something else. So maybe after this talk, I'll go and get started on that process. But so we know that we have parts of the economy and major parts of the economy, like the automotive sector, that need to degrow and turn into nothing. But at the same time, we also know that when we're thinking about production and consumption and distribution, certain parts of production, consumption, distribution can help with well-being and high living standards, and others don't. And especially when we're trying to achieve, if our goal, we should state that, is to achieve high living standards at low resource use, certain modes of production and consumption and distribution are better than others. And that's one of the things that in my work we try to measure, we try to model. And for instance, one of the things we can see is that economic growth itself is not very helpful at producing increases in things like living standards or life expectancy. Other things are. Things like electricity use in the household is much more highly correlated with improvements in something as basic as life expectancy. So if we're trying to understand, we need to be much more granular and specific in the ways that Bina was talking about as well, in terms of what types of production, what types of consumption, what types of distribution really do help. And we have to raise the issue of structural inequality, because inequality is not just inefficient, it's also unjust, it also enables exploitation, also enables corruption in our political systems. So we have to understand what and why and how production and consumption can be changed. and production consumption can degrow very much. Another thing I want to raise is that when we're looking, so one of the researchers in my group is looking at this right now, in a very granular way at developing countries, you see that increases in living standards are associated with reductions in total energy use, total energy footprint, so both direct and indirect. And that's because overconsumption looks different in different contexts. You have overconsumption of the super rich, which is luxury consumption, but you also have what Barbara Ehrenreich called it's expensive to be poor, the overconsumption related to poverty, where you cannot afford the means of consuming less and having high living standards because you lack the money to have, or the access to have more efficient supply chains or conversion technologies. So I think all of these things we need to think about much more precisely and in less generality. And once we do that, it actually makes our lives easier in terms of saying what this new economy could look like that we need to move towards. In moving towards that new economy, I don't think that the main issues standing in our way are disagreements between ecological economics or degrowth, or even global north, global south, but I think they do have to do with what other people were mentioning, which are the structural imperatives of exploitation, extraction, profit making of capitalism, which has a very multinational face right now. And so that's what we're up against. We're up against mega multinational economic structures that are really driving worsening poverty in a lot of cases and worsening environmental disaster in others. And I think that that's something that ecological economics should also take on board much more clearly. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Julia, for sharing your thoughts. And let me introduce Matthias Schmelzer, who is an economic historian. He's a networker and a climate activist. And he is the author of the book, The Hegemony of Growth, and the co-editor of Degrowth in Movements. Matthias, you have the floor. Matthias, we cannot hear you. No, I cannot hear you. No. So let me suggest that maybe Josh introduces Emanuele, and then Matthias can maybe see whether he can solve the technical issue. Thank you, Emanuele, and sorry, Matthias. We'll wait for you in a minute. Emanuele?
All right. So, yeah, my pleasure to introduce Emanuele. He's an associate professor at the University of Bologna. He's also a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science and affiliated scientist at the RFF CMCC European Institute on Economics and the Environment. His research focuses on the links between climate change, macro financial systems, and sustainability transitions. And he is working on a 5-year grant for sustainable finance for a smooth, low-carbon transition. So I turn the floor to you, Emanuele.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. So I believe I might be the one with the strongest discomfort regarding the alliance between degrowth and ecological economics. That's probably why I was invited, and let me try to explain you why. So one word of premise is that ever since I started interacting with the ecological economics community, that was more than 10 years ago, degrowth scholars have always been there. And I always enjoyed the fact that they were, because they were raising interesting questions, and in general, they were bringing good energy to the table of ecological economics. So I was always very comfortable with degrowth as a subset of ecological economics in my mind. The origin of my discomfort lies in the enormous success that degrowth had in more recent years, which led the research space in ecological economics to be strongly dominated by degrowth-related questions, leaving little space for others, non-degrowth-based research questions. So one small example from last year at the EASY conference in Turku, for instance, the initial call for applications was listing the topics of the conference, right? And with sub-themes, and everything I work on, so ecological, macroeconomics, finance, political economy, was listed as sub-themes of under the headline building a post-growth economics, assuming that being part of ecological economics and working on those topics meant wanting to build a post-growth economics, or at least wanting to study a post-growth economics, which was not my case. That was changed, but then things went even further in this direction, right? So now we have joint conferences for 2 years in a row due to COVID. But this is, a very strong signal that is sent to members of the two communities, as well as people outside these communities. And also in consideration of the fact that we probably agree on this, the degrowth part of this alliance is the dominant one, right? So just to give a small example, in the banner for this event, the title of this event, it was called Degrowth for an Ecological Economy, once again suggesting that in order to participate to ecological economics, one already has to agree that degrowth is a valid strategy to achieve an ecological economy, which might be the case or not, right? So the feeling is there in the air. And let me be clear that I'm not really criticizing the strategy per se. The strategy could make sense. It's not really my place to say what ecological economics should or should not be, but also the strategy has some clear benefits. Degrowth, as I was saying, has been very successful, attracting new people, new ideas, especially in younger generations. And ecological economics, I think, needs this new blood and these new ideas. What I want to do here is just to raise a point, which is this strategy comes at a cost. And the cost is the possible loss of richness and diversity in the contributions, and that is materialized in the loss of some researchers that might perceive themselves as part of ecological economics because of the methods that they use or because of the topics that they address, but they are not interested. They're just not interested in the degrowth research question, or they feel uncomfortable with the usual normative positions of the degrowth movement, because of course degrowth is not a neutral thing, right? It comes with a whole baggage that you have to accept. And so this is, a question that I pose. People, if you look, for instance, at the community of evolutionary political economy, EP, that is just ongoing in these days, there's a lot of people presenting on environment and economy interactions. These are all people that could easily be part of ecological economics, but they're not. They go to this other conference. And even in environmental economics, there are a portion of these contributions that could easily be part of ecological economics, but once again, they're not. Because one of the reasons could be that going to environmental economics do not force them to pose themselves the question of what is my normative position, but just present their research without any implications. So the question that I have in mind is ecological economics ready to bear these costs for the benefits of being allied with the degrowth very lively movement? Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuele, for your comment. So let us try now if Matthias, if you're here, and I think so, can you try whether your sound works now? Matthias? So it looks like Matthias cannot speak. So while I call him by phone and see whether we can solve the technical issue, I would suggest that, yeah, Matthias?
Yes, it seems
yes,
to be working
please.
now.
Yeah, you have the floor. Thank you for being here.
Sorry for the technical issues, yes. So thanks for organizing this very important debate. I'm speaking as a scholar activist who's been involved with degrowth, in particular for the last years. And I want to argue that an exclusive or too close an alliance, or even merging between degrowth and ecological economics is problematic for various reasons. Rather, what we need is what I call strategic alliances with each other and beyond, with clear focuses and involving mutual criticisms and learning. And I want to give 5 short points and reasons for this. To begin with, as has been said many times, degrowth is not just an academic perspective, but much broader political project, social philosophy, worldview, etc. So degrowth does need alliances far beyond academia. And in our book, Degrowth in Movements, we've tried to outline some in the realm of social movements, and I think we need similar alliances in many other realms, political parties, etc. Secondly, degrowth is not primarily an ecological perspective or movement, as would be suggested by too close an alliance to ecological economics. So ecological questions, in particular climate catastrophe, is key and is often an entry point to degrowth for many. But then I think the perspective is much wider. It's focusing on the alienating and crisis-ridding role of growth and accumulation in our societies more general. Thirdly, and more fundamentally, degrowth is not just a call for a different kind of economics or a new economic school, but also, on top of this, degrowth is a call to escape the economy, so to overcome economistic thinking and to question social power and also the hegemony of economics as a discipline in our societies. So key degrowth arguments, and I would say these are still underdeveloped in comparison to the ecological economics arguments for degrowth. These degrowth arguments take a look from the outside and analyze how we as a society came to see reproduction, so production and reproduction activities, as the economy, to focus on markets and prices, to the exclusion of care and nature, how economics came to dominate public debates about all questions related to production, consumption, resources, etc., and how all of this could be changed. Fourth point is that key degrowth questions have to be answered by disciplines other than economics or ecological economics. And I'm thinking here in particular, but there's many others, in particular about questions of transformation. So how do we change society so fundamentally as our shared analysis say they need to change? How do we wield the collective power we need? Which alliances are necessary in society to have that power? And for this, we need answers from history, sociology, education studies, psychology, intersectional studies of power and discrimination, on race, gender, abilities, and of course, much more. So I would welcome alliances with these various disciplines that could be organized around common conferences, but also start much smaller with workshops, books, special issues, as is already happening. But I think this is a key focus to grow. And finally, degrowth is and has to be more radical than ecological economics, both in degrowth's academic paradigm sense, but also beyond academia. And this does not necessarily have to be understood as a critique of ecological economics, even though it sometimes is exactly that, and Katja has raised some of the points in this direction. And I can't go into the details how degrowth is more radical, but I think we all have a general shared analysis of this. For example, degrowth scholars focus a lot on analyzing capitalism and argue that this is a questioning of capitalism, wage labor, questions of markets, etc., have to be at the core of a degrowth perspective. Also, degrowth is not just about analysis, but it's prognostic. We work on utopias of a future society. And finally, there's also a growing consensus within the degrowth community that states that, in fact, degrowth amounts to, or has to amount to, decolonizing power structures in society in many different ways. So to overcome neocolonial ways of seeing the world and also neocolonial ways of organizing the world economy. So coming to an end, what is my proposal? I would suggest to keep degrowth and ecological economics separate to some degree, but discuss and create what I call strategic alliances. So alliances that have a clear strategic function with regard to our shared goals. And I just want to give one example. I think in creating and promoting shared arguments and thus become stronger together in the public realm on points such as a decoupling of emissions from growth is impossible in the remaining time for rich countries, or growth does not create welfare for the many, also regarding to the global south, or economies can function stable without economic growth under these conditions. And here I would argue degrowth urgently needs to be backed up by economics, a different kind of economics also by ecological economics, and by a form of ecological economics that cannot easily be dismissed as activist, non-academic, and unscientific. So for these reasons, I think we shouldn't have too close of alliances, but rather strategic alliances where they meet both our goals. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Matthias. I'm happy you were able to join. And now we are going to give back the words to the speakers very briefly, just a couple of minutes each. We will follow the same order, I would suggest. And then with Josh, we will read afterwards the questions and the comments from the participants. And again, we will get a reaction by the speakers. So without further delay, I would invite Katja to comment on what the other speakers said. And then we follow the same order. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for your introductions. So I would like to make a comment on this issue or the argument that growth is needed for the global south, but we need degrowth in the global north or in the rich countries, because I think there is some kind of issue there that is not so easy to articulate, and where within ecological economics and maybe to some extent within degrowth, people hold different positions on this. So I will try to explain how I see degrowth in this way. So for me, degrowth is not a verb, it's a noun. So it's kind of a bigger concept. So it is not about reducing GDP and kind of cutting things here and there to make economies work in ecological terms. So it is not about shrinking growth, but reducing biophysical throughput whilst ensuring well-being for all. So which is likely to lead to smaller kind of growth in GDP terms, but it is not the aim in the first place. So then when we speak of poverty and kind of that economic growth is needed for poverty, to solve poverty, here I would also kind of align more with the perspective, say, from anthropology and from post-colonial thought, because poverty itself is a construction that has been defined by an organization, the World Bank, which of course thinks in economic terms. And then if defined in economic and in monetary terms, then surely we will need economic growth to solve poverty. So in that sense, I think that I would go even away from, or problematize poverty at least, and maybe to run the discussion in different terms, because actually skyrocketing growth in many, let's say, emerging or developing, so-called emerging developing countries has not led to many people being better off. So many have lost their ways of subsistence, and it has been also, as Bina has pointed out, very much defined by class, race, caste, and things like this. So in that sense, and we still have a lot of poverty in the world. So maybe I would say that we should speak instead of poverty about needs satisfaction. So what we need in the global south is the satisfaction of needs in material terms, and then of course it can lead to growth in some sectors, and it can lead to kind of phasing out of others. So I would kind of frame a discussion in a different way, and I think this is kind of from a degrowth perspective, it is an accurate way to frame. So yeah.
Thanks, Katja, for staying within the 2 minutes. Bina?
Yeah, thank you for this very rich discussion. I think I like the idea of talking about strategic alliances, because it does really talk about critical dialogue, and we be able to discuss where are the meeting points when they are not. But I want to use this couple of minutes to come back to a point. I think inequality is actually at the heart of our discussion. Now, this is global inequalities between countries, this is within countries, this is within communities and within households. And the reason for this is that we can, what we have to, even Katja's comments right now said that, okay, we need to talk about basic needs. You produce more, but you need to produce more for the poor. And you're not going to have that if you've got deep inequalities. So, of course, we agree that people shouldn't have 6 air conditioners and 5 cars parked outside their homes. But nobody is going to disagree that everybody needs healthcare, everybody needs access to education and food security. So there are a lot of goods which can be produced, which need to grow. And that's not possible as long as you have such deep inequalities. And I don't think either ecological economics or degrowth have an answer to that. And when they begin to have an answer to that, I think there isn't that much, there's a great deal to talk about between the global north and the global south. I also don't think in a globalized world, we can separate this distinction between the two. India produces a lot of drugs, it has some of the biggest pharma industries, and yet it imports some basic ingredients from China. And so you can't produce these drugs unless you bring those ingredients from China. I'm just giving an example of something that's as basic as essential medicine today in COVID times. So let's agree that we don't have enough answers, and I don't see the word degrowth, and it means many things to many people, or stopping growth is the issue. The issue is we can't grow in the way we've been growing, but we could grow in different ways. A second and very quick point is that we do need a new economics. So I did talk about the importance of institutions and cooperation within communities across countries, but our standard economics does not see people as being able to cooperate because it sees self-interest as the guiding force of human behavior. And we need to shift away from that. So although there is a recognition in the development of economics, there's trust and reciprocity and all of that matters, which is the basis of cooperation. We haven't yet gone enough in that direction. So let me end with that because there are a lot of other people who'd like to say things.
Thanks, Bina. Senya? Ksenia, you want to react?
Sorry. Now, yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much to all of you for your wonderful presentations. I learned a lot and I could reflect, and I agree that alliances should be from both sides, the growth and ecological economics, and that it has to be addressed multidisciplinary, but also transdisciplinary, coming from the communities themselves. And as I said in my previous presentation, those voices and the will of real transformation must come from the communities themselves. Yes, that's all I had to say. Thank you.
And Emmanuel, would you like to add your comments? Oh, I'm sorry, Julia, would you like to add your comments?
I don't have any. I think that this was a really good discussion with many different views on sort of instrumental versus content ideas. I don't necessarily think that there's ever going to be a neutral economics, but that doesn't mean that different aspects of economics can't be helpful. So I do see Emanuela's point there. And I agree with Bina that distribution and the power structures that go with it have to be at the heart of what's going on and what we're thinking about. So with that, I'd just like the discussion to be brought.
So we could put Matthias back in the original order. Do you have anything else to add?
Sure, thanks. I hope it works. I have 2 points. The first is about the term degrowth. I think, or the way I've been working with degrowth in the context of social movements, and we've created a lot of kind of like collaboration with the climate justice movement in particular. And we don't think about degrowth as a term for the new broader social movement that will bring about fundamental societal change. But rather we hope that the degrowth perspective will be taken up within other contexts. So within other social movements, from trade unions to feminist movements, etc. And I would see this similarly with other contexts, not social movements, but also within academia. So I would welcome it very much if the degrowth perspective is taken up. And that does not necessarily have to be the term. So I think we should kind of like let loose of this term, because it's working in some contexts, it has benefits, but in some contexts it's standing in the way of what we want to achieve. And then I leave it with this. Yeah, I look forward to for the questions also in particular.
All right, then Emanuela, I think you have your opportunity to make concluding comments before we turn to questions.
Thanks. Just one small intervention, because there were a number of questions in the chat about what I said, degrowth, coming with a normative baggage. And, I agree that all research questions carry some kind of normative baggage, as was written in the chat, either explicitly or, in the background. I think we can agree, I hope we can agree, that degrowth is different in that the normative component is much, much more pronounced. And it's in the nature of the degrowth movement, right? So it's part academic and part activism. And that's, I think something that is recognized and acknowledged and embraced by degrowth scholars. So that's what I meant by it. Being asked to subscribe to these normative positions might make some academic researchers uncomfortable. That's it.
So, all right, let me unmute here. Oh yeah, I'm unmuted. So now we will turn to questions. And I think what we're going to do is Betty very nicely organized the questions by topic and questioner. So I'll mostly focus on the questions to ecological economists and Betty to degrowth people. And the first question was submitted by my friend Jeff Garver, who says that ecological economics is sometimes described as a transdiscipline that unfortunately contains the word economics. And he's asking, for EE folks, does that ring true? And what does it mean? And for degrowth folks, does that help bridge the gap? And I would add to that a comment, which I don't have the name here of who posted it, unfortunately, who says that, unfortunately, anything remotely resembling economics generally drifts into foundations of objectivist ontologies for support. Although a relational ontology framework may be difficult for answering the usual economic questions, I'm afraid as far as sustainability is concerned, there is no alternative. Behavior guided by objectivist ontologies will always tend toward unsustainability. So I thought that reflects on Jeff's question, whether, many people in ecological economics consider the use of the word economics unfortunate. So that's an open question to any of the panelists who would like to respond.
Josh, should we maybe read 3 or 4 questions and then, or maybe all of them, and then give back the word to the speakers, just to make it a little bit more lively? All right,
if they have, and if they have a place to take notes, then they can. And you just want to bounce back and forth, where between, because I thought we could focus on the general questions, perhaps, and specific ones to individuals.
Yeah, you're right.
But there are a few other general ones too. So if you want to add any of those.
I don't know if anybody wants to answer to this, then fine.
So any comments from either ecological economists who want to defend the use of the word economics is really an integral part, or recognize that that seems to be a little bit exclusive, reducing our transdisciplinary perspective, or if degrowthers, if that would help address some of their concerns with ecological economics, recognizing that many ecological economists aren't from an economics background, or they're essentially taking an ecological perspective on the economy. So looking at the human economy, like we might look at a, polar bear economy. I mean, it's the ecological perspectives of energy flows.
I could go.
Right.
Yes, yes. So I do think that the fact that degrowth has this rather close alliance with ecological economics has to do with the fact that in recent years, a lot of academic work on degrowth has come from ecological economics. But this does not necessarily have to be this way. For example, feminist economics is a perspective that I would argue is as close to degrowth as ecological economics. So it's kind of like rather is an historical residual, this alliance, and it should be discussed whether it makes sense to leave it this way or rather to kind of like break it open, as I've argued in my input. And I do think going beyond this, that going from looking at it from the other side, we certainly also need disciplines that look at what normal economists look at from a different perspective. And thus, the term ecological economics is also a huge, useful bridge term, because certainly calling oneself an economist creates legitimacy to discuss certain questions in the public realm, which I think is totally key and which could give a lot of backing to degrowth arguments that are certainly necessary.
Okay, I'll have a little go at this. Shall I, Josh?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. Economics, if we shift away from economics and talk about the economy, I don't think we disagree that the economy matters. People's jobs matter, their livelihoods matter. All of these things that are, we're talking about social security matters, we're talking about poverty, multidimensional poverty, all of this matters. And so we are talking about the economy, and we can't do away with that. And I think calling it ecological economics, we can't call it ecological anthropology. That doesn't help. I don't see a problem in actually calling it ecological economics. However, economists are very powerful, and mainstream economists are extremely powerful. So I do think it is very important to have a whole range of critiques of the mainstream. And there has been a degree of success. Ecological economics is a very good example of that. There is feminist economics. I don't think feminist economics is the same as degrowth. I would disagree with that, but that's for another day. I think there is institutional economics. There is donut economics. We can name like 15 mechanisms of 15 trajectories by which people are critiquing mainstream economics. And I think those are all very important trajectories, and they seek interdisciplinarity. So ecological economics recognizes interdisciplinarity as a core feature, not just ecology, also law, also anthropology. You have to start somewhere. So let's start by talking about alternatives to the mainstream.
And I'll just comment that it was a lawyer actually who posted that question, or that comment about economics perhaps being an unfortunate. So just verifying your point, Veena. And are there any comments by anybody about this idea that you need relational ontologies? Because I see feminist economics and degrowth very often is focused on the relational ontologies, and that mainstream neoclassical economics has this objectivist approach. Do any of the participants have any comments on that? Whether we really do need to take a relational approach to economics?
What do you mean by relational approach, for instance?
Well, the way I understood, I mean, this is I was talking about, so relational, I mean, I would look at is economics is about the relationships between people. So really it's kind of economy embedded in society. And there's, whereas objectivist is kind of this hard, concrete, and I'm not positive I actually understand. I'm not a philosopher, so it was a philosopher type language. But the way I interpreted the question is that, can we examine taking the mainstream conventional approach where it's mathematical, objective, going to equilibrium? Will that always conflict with sustainability? Or do we really need to shape economics to focus on relationships between people? What I would interpret that is re-embedding the economy in society, as Polanyi used to talk about. I don't know if anybody has any comments on that, or if that's just kind of too abstract.
Maybe I can say a few things. I think that the term economics and the power of mainstream economics are not problematic, but they have to be understood as to what they mean and where they come from. And so mainstream economics has a very strong role of power because it supports and comforts existing inequalities and power structures. It is the servant of existing ownership and profit making. And that what it is trying to create, the focus on equilibrium is partly because it sees its mission as creating stable conditions for that profit making to keep happening. And I don't think that it's necessarily a relational ontology or an embeddedness, but what we have to understand is we have to understand that there are no such things as natural laws of the economy, that these are socially created, that the economy is an expression of social relations, and that's from a Marxian political economy perspective that we have to understand, you know, as ecological economics or degrowthers, we have to understand why the economy is the way it is, why those roles, why those structures reproduce themselves, why they are supported by power and reinforced by power. And we also have to understand that if we want to change anything, we have to go up against that power. So it's no use, you know, creating nice alternative models or utopias or whatever, as if you don't realize what you're up against in terms of the conflict that has to happen for anything to change. Change will not happen because we discuss things in a nice way. That's not how it works. And I think that sometimes the focus on economics in both degrowth and ecological economics gives us the false sense that an alternative understanding of economics can change the world, and that's not true.
All right. So, Betty, do you want to ask the next round of questions?
Yeah, happy to do that. So, because I think it is a little bit linked, I'm going to ask this question since it has already emerged from, I think, a comment from Matthias on the issue of capitalism. So the question comes specific to Bina, and it is, you can see it in the chat, is capitalism a unifying opposition to the range of alternative economics frameworks, or do you have to be anti-capitalist to count as alternative? I would invite Bina to respond, but in general, I would invite also the other speakers to react to this, because I think it's a central issue to be discussed. So what would be the position of ecological economics and degrowth on capitalism, which is a big question, of course. I wish somebody could define capitalism.
Yeah, actually, I very much like Senya to talk about it, because she raised it in her initial comments, and Emmanuel, and I can come in later.
Sure, we can do that. Emanuele or Xenia, or anybody else, if you want, you're welcome to step in. I think we are open to anybody to comment on this question of capitalism. Thanks.
I am Tangaveli speaking from India. I would like to know that the concept of economics is actually related with the eco, you know, that the term is normally prescribed for homo, the word is prescribed for eco, that ever since the Greek period, the same term, that is eco. The definition is what I like to quote on this. Ecological and economic is the same concept. So that the term, even that economic itself, we can change, interpret in a way such ecological natural operations, minute information characteristic system. This minute information characteristic systems, what we face at present, you know, this COVID-19 is an example for it. Ever since whatever that term, the growth or degrowth, whatever it may be, the statistical measurement, what we do on our day-to-day affairs for measuring that distribution, productions, whatever it may be, it's based on the purely numerical concerns. So that the numerical concern is to be taken to consider for all. But anyhow, that natural operation is main criteria for everything. And that should take into consideration for determining the real value of the growth, so that we can estimate the real growth, whether it is minus or plus. This that agriculture is the main criteria for all countries. At present, this is the only operations we do. So we can put it in such a way that economical terms may be fixed for certain definition, because the definition is going on forever. The productions, distribution on basis of sociological only. When the sociological concept is there is no value of measuring the natural. The natural existing, we are one of the human beings. They are also a natural being. So we should take into concern for ours as a human being as a natural thing, so that there is no deviations between the degrowth and growth. And this I just I'm an analyst on terminology. I quote all in this my Facebook also. It's Sayamantam. That podcast I release on something. With that, I quote some health is the main concept for our things. Health is equal to we are having educations, we are having skills, so that with this concept we can do wonderful things. This we can interpret as a wide affective. See, wide affective we can. That we can concept is universally accepted. Wide affective cumulative action network. That cumulative action network is most essential for all human beings. So wide affect is that. Whatever the growth is there, we have wide effect, so that we can do it. We can do it in the sense, develop organizations individually. Every individual has that tendency to do it in the conscious eye and my intention. I individually growth. I take initiative on this.
So I'd like to ask politely that you wrap up very quickly so we don't dominate too much. Yeah.
No, thank you for your valuable time. Sorry for the intervention. And just do it with the skills. With that, I conclude. This we can do it with the skills, whatever we have. But this, thank you very much for your valuable time for sharing my views on this. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. In principle, we ask participants to please intervene via the chat.
Yes.
And we give the word only to the speakers. I'm sorry about that. This is the rules we set and are set for all the symposiums. It's a little bit to try and keep a little bit of order, but you are most welcome to write your comments and question in the chat, and with Josh, we will make sure to read them. So I would go back to the speakers now, and we wanted to comment on this question on capitalism. So I would ask if any speakers want to intervene. Otherwise, we give the word to Bina. Thank you, sir, again for your intervention. Please mute your microphone. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay. I mean, it's a big question, but I think people talk about alternatives in a multiple range of ways. Sometimes they're talking about alternatives in a very localized way, and sometimes they're talking about entire systems like capitalism. So I don't think just simply because people are not critiquing entire systems and they're dealing with inequalities and power issues in a local context, that is not an alternative. Of course it is. And so that would be my general answer to this, that we need, if you like, hundreds of oppositions to many of the things, injustices, environmental and other, that we see happening around us. And to say, well, this is not the way to go. This is an alternative way to go. And I would say we should empower all of them. And perhaps they could, people react locally in terms of what affects them, in terms of what they can control, because they can't control entire systems. But that does not make it any the less valuable.
Thank you, Bina. Anybody else among the speakers who wants to intervene?
I would like to. Katya, can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I would say that the kinds of changes that we need, they require systemic change, so that all the different local and the different local efforts can contribute to it. So, and this systemic change is change beyond capitalism and against capitalism. So I have already articulated in my introductory intervention that degrowth and capitalism are not compatible, and I can elaborate on it a little bit. So I would say that capitalism always comes with primitive accumulation, so starting from Marx, but then others have developed this point, so such as land grabbing, dispossession in different forms, so whether via the credit system or via the housing market, and then evictions of people from their houses in times of capitalist crisis. So, and this primitive accumulation, it's not just kind of inherent to the how capitalism started or starts. So it is something that goes with it as capital is searching for spaces for expansion. So, but then also there is this kind of violence of capitalism, I would argue, that goes beyond primitive accumulation. And I think ecological economics has contributed a lot to articulating it, in the sense that there is a particular social metabolism that is created within capitalism by striving for growth. Ecological degradation comes, and we cannot decouple the two. And then another dimension that has been, of course, very much developed within the Marxist and eco-socialist thought is that exploitation, alienation of labor is key to kind of also to capitalism, and it is a different world where we should seek for alternatives. So, but what I would also like to say is that, of course, it is capitalism that is the main system of today, that the critique should be kind of channeled to, but it is important to say that if we transition to a system beyond capitalism, say socialism, which is still geared on growth, that will be as problematic. So, because again, this decoupling issue will come in, and we will not have the kind of alternative that is envisioned by, say, eco-socialists. So, yeah, I would like to leave it here, and maybe just to wrap up by saying that, yes, this transition from economics to economy is something that helps to politicize economy, which is something that has been taken away from the studies of economy by the discipline of economics.
Any further comments on that topic?
I might jump in. I'm not really sure what I want to say, though, in the sense that these are questions, all these questions are all interesting questions that in my mind boil down to what exactly is ecological economics, which is a non-answered question. I've been to countless ecological economics conferences where this question was posed. It is a very self-reflective community, and that's good. But that leaves the boundaries a bit vague and fuzzy. So I was thinking, for instance, about this question on capitalism. I have really the same question. So is opposition to capitalism a precondition to be part of the ecological economy, of the ecological economics community? For instance, I'm not a fan of capitalism, of course, but I can also envision ways in which sustainability transitions take place within a capitalistic context. Yeah, and there has been lots of research on that. Does that make me? Does that put me outside ecological economics, or is ecological economics inclusive enough to accept these positions, right? And the same goes for growth, degrowth. Of course, there's always the question, you know, what is growth? What do you mean by growth? And I think one of the certain tenets of ecological economics is that material growth in a finite planet cannot go on forever. Can economic growth go on forever? That is GDP growth. That, honestly, I have no answer. I mean, I can see the reasons why one would argue that it's not possible. I can also see the reasons why one could argue that it has never happened. The coupling has never happened, but it could happen in the future under certain assumptions, right? So people like Van den Berg, Jeroen van den Berg, right? He's he's in Barcelona. He's the one proposing this vision of a growth as a useful concept. That is, we don't talk about growth, we don't talk about degrowth. Let's just forget about the thing, the growth concept, and let's just focus on the issues, right? For instance, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Is this compatible with ecological? It's certainly incompatible with degrowth, I'm guessing, but is it compatible with ecological economics? This is also something I'm honestly confused on. So maybe Josh, you could be the one probably trying to answer this question.
Well, so I think this is a really important topic because you're bringing up issues asked by a lot of people. What is the relationship between, between growth and ecological economics? Is it possible to believe in, dematerialization as a path forward where we can continue growing? And this capitalist idea that we have, a lot of people define capitalism as this continually expanding spiral of growth, essentially. It's very growth oriented. So a number of people have directed questions at Bina and you, Manuel, very typically asking about whether or not ecological economics really does imply a reduction in growth. And I would like to add into this, Bina has made it very clear we need healthcare, we need all sorts of other, we need greater equality. And looking at healthcare, if we see a population of people physically growing bigger, we can assume probably they're getting better nutrition, meeting their needs met. If we take the average height of everybody in this conference and add the tallest person in the world, it has no impact on the average height. On the other hand, if we take a look at the average income and then add the richest person in the world, the average incomes of the people in this room mean nothing. It's only the richest person that matters. So growth is typically defined as an aggregate measure of increasing GDP or increasing income. And what I want to ask is this idea, so does it make sense to think about these aggregate measures where they're power law distributions? Very few individuals have most of it. All the growth in the United States in the past decade has gone to the top 1%. Should we be talking about growth as a goal or is it that a growth is maybe ignoring growth altogether? And then getting to these questions that a lot of people have asked, saying that their understanding of ecological economics is that it is founded on the impossibility of continued physical growth. There's this question about, dematerialization, but I think that's I would like to raise that for Bina, for you, Manuel, for other people, whether or not this, first of all, whether growth tells us anything meaningful about well-being. That's my example. If height goes up, we know people are getting better off. If GDP goes up, we know nothing about the average person. So I'm curious what panelists think about that. I mean, is it possible to favor, the ecological economists? Is there any point in discussing growth as a goal when without, as Bina is very clear about, actually focusing on distribution too, but isn't distribution take precedent? I'm curious what the panelists think about that. And
okay,
perhaps, yeah.
Thank you. I'm happy to come in here. I think the idea that GDP is the principal matrix today for looking at development, if you like, it's just a straw horse or a straw man. We began to, even within development economics, we began to question this a long time ago. The 1970s was a period where there was a huge expansion of ideas of redistribution with growth, redistribution for growth, the question of basic needs, the question of capabilities and development as freedom. So I think GDP is no longer accepted, even unless there are some really diehard people who've gone to sleep over 5 decades and forgotten what has happened in between. And nobody is holding out that GDP is the measure that we're talking about. Yet people are talking about, if you like, multidimensional measures of looking at. And I started by saying, what do we produce? How do we produce it? And how do we distribute what we produce? And so in my view, redistribution is really, in a much larger sense, not just in terms of produced goods and services, but the redistribution of a lot of stuff. Of resources, of political power, you go through the spectrum, is essential in order for us to even rethink the basket of goods that we are going to produce, which have priority. So that's that. Anyway, that's one position. The second is, I did want to come in a couple of small points. One is that, I'm sorry, poverty is not the invention of the World Bank. Poverty is a lived experience of millions of people who don't have housing, who don't have healthcare, who can't send their children to school. Trying to measure it, even today we recognize over the last 10 years at least, there's multidimensional poverty. The Human Development Index tried to talk about human well-being, broaden it. The trouble is that the moment you try and give figures and compare things, you reduce very broad and important ideas to narrow matrices. So when Amartya Sen talked about, capabilities, he talked about multi-dimensions of it, including freedoms. The freedom from hunger, but freedom to do things. It's very difficult to then reduce this to a measurement. People have tried. But but to say that there's been no discussion on it, that people are not, that a lot of economists globally are deeply uncomfortable and haven't critiqued GDP, I don't think that's correct. And finally, on one point that Emmanuel made, that degrowth is bringing a lot of young people. That's very good. But I would say that's true for ecological economics as well. If you look at the global south, Indian Society for Ecological Economics has a large number of younger people. You have several hundred members. It's pretty inclusive. So yes, if you ask deep questions like how do we transform or throw out capitalism, perhaps not all of them are engaged with that, although some might be. So I think we do need to see this dialogue as covering both the global north and the global south. And you'll find that there are a lot of alternatives, there are solutions, there are critiques that are happening, which perhaps, and they would be within the domain of ecological economics, but also other disciplines. And I think there's, so we need to expand these circles of dialogue, Josh, and see where people are comfortable and where they are not.
And as a follow-on question to that, I actually look at Amartya Sen as talking about development rather than growth, and that growth is a quantitative increase, development is a qualitative improvement. And I'm actually curious, Katja, what are your perspectives on this, where you actually say degrowth is kind of opposed to the notion of development, whereas, I think Amartya Sen's position of the human capabilities and human functionings is, I view that as development. I'm curious what your perspectives are on what, if degrowth is opposed to growth and opposed to at least the Western imposition of definition of development. What are your perspectives on this debate between qualitative and quantitative improvements?
Yeah, thank you. So as far as I know, critiques of development is another kind of important pillar that has informed degrowth research. So like ecological economics, and at the kind of start of degrowth as a concept, Latouche, for example, has been informed also, his position on degrowth has been informed by critiques of development. But then other perspectives have come in to kind of to make this point. But the point would be that development brings kind of domination of the global, that is North-dominated economic or North-created economic system to spaces, all spaces of the world, and perhaps with growth, some people can be left out of poverty, but also it comes with a lot of dispossession. So, for example, in the context of India, there was a very nice book by Alpa Shah on Grounded Down by Growth, I think it's called. It's an anthropological perspective on how growth in the Indian context has also left out a lot of people or channeled them in the ways of working and doing things that kind of benefits the global capitalist economy. In that sense, degrowth builds alliances with the critiques of development and alternatives to development. So, for example, the Pluriverse book that Fede has been involved in editing, so it does make this point. So with making a point that growth and development are not working and too tied to this growth-centric, capital-centric system. So let's think of alternatives from different parts of the world that can channel us into a different direction. And then, of course, yeah, degrowth speaks to the global north more than it is ecological Swaraj that is discussed for the Indian context, when we were for Bolivia and Ecuador. And there are many kind of concepts out there that go beyond growth and development. So yeah, I hope it clarifies it.
And Matthias, do you have something you'd like to add here as well?
Yes, I just wanted to shortly react to this discussion of basically the importance of growth and this focus on growth in the degrowth debate. It might be that the focus on GDP, or the argument that GDP is the main goal of economics, is a strawman within parts of economics. But I would say it's not a strawman if we look at the entire society and at politics more broadly. And within this context, certainly degrowth, the critical thrust of degrowth still has a lot of important things to play. And this is, I think, one of the key tasks to kind of like undermine this, this notion that is very dominant within politics in general. And I think this has a lot to do with us living in capitalist economies within which there is a necessity for this societal focus on accumulation, which is then translated in the GDP numbers within economics statistics. And I would say kind of like the starting points are different. The starting point for the degrowth discussion is based on the growing evidence that a decoupling of resource throughput, emissions, etc., and GDP within the countries of the global north. So very specifically, that this is very, very unlikely. How do we go from this starting point? And then the entire question is like, how do we build economies that are not dependent on economic growth? Very, very important questions that are that cannot be answered solely by economics, but have to be answered by many other disciplines as well. So this is, I think, where for answering the question of how a post-capitalist, post-growth economy looks like, we do need a broader discussion that goes beyond economics, because a lot of important arguments come from other disciplines that we need to take into account.
And one final thing, Emmanuel, do you want to give any more insights into your view that how possibly we could have a sustainable capitalism?
Well, that's a lot to ask.
What are the questions?
No, yeah, I can say a few obvious words, but I wanted to react also to this discussion that we're having about economics and the use of the term economics and the concept of economics as part of ecological economics. I feel that actually the term and the concept economics in ecological economics is incredibly important, right? So that's what the discipline, as far as I understand, that's one of the reasons why it was born, to provide an alternative economic thinking to the, let's call it the mainstream, literally in the sense of the mainstream of research at the time, to provide alternative economic thinking, in that, you know, you want to study the interactions between human societies and environment and resources, except that you don't really believe in certain methods, right? In the case of modeling, for instance, you typically ecological economists would reject intertemporal optimization of welfare or rationality of agents and so on. But there are other approaches to economics, many others, as Bina was saying as well, and even in something as dry as economic modeling, you have alternative approaches. And actually, ecological economics, the journal, has been one of the main areas in which this ecological macroeconomics type of modeling has been flourishing, and this provides alternatives. So I would not only keep the economics part, but I would actually strengthen it. You know, from an economics perspective, ecological economics suffer exactly from the opposite problem. That is, there is too little economic thinking, and transdisciplinarity, of course, is one of the distinctive characteristics of ecological economics, which we all want to maintain. But we cannot lose the economics part in favor of non-economics, right? So agent-based modeling, for instance, I don't work on it, but agent-based modeling, is it too much of an economic tool to be part of ecological economics? I don't think so, right? So they start from some different ontological foundations and assumptions, and they try to provide real world applied economic thinking. So that's something that I think we actually desperately need. And for what concerns capitalism, I mean, this could go on forever, but the usual approach, let's call it the mainstream approach once again, although it's not really an academic point, but the mainstream approach of, for instance, putting a price on the carbon content of goods and services can be criticized as much as you want, but that is a capitalistic based policy tool that, if applied, could work. And of course, you could argue it's never going to be applied because of some other parts of some other dimensions of capitalism, but that's not really true, though, is it? Because it's being applied. Maybe the speed is not enough, or it has other issues, but the direction is that one, right? All this discussion about sustainable finance, yeah, which is being criticized, rightly so, for being too market driven, too finance friendly, too slow, and so on. But isn't that a welcome capitalistic based policy initiative that we want to support? Question.
So any further comments on this topic? I have to say that as a moderator, I'm finding it difficult to read through the questions, pay attention to the talks, and remain coherent. So I apologize for sometimes an inadequate job moderating. I see Fede nodding his head.
Same here.
Yeah.
Josh,
So-
I wanted to, if I may just add, take only 30 seconds, is that feminist economics, and one can ask the same questions. The adding feminist to economics, itself is somebody's, feminism is about changing things from a feminist perspective, seen as movements, but it's also very powerful if you add it to economics. And it's brought what has been long-standingly invisible, made visible, even within the economy. I mean, take the whole discussion on the care economy and what women do, all the work of the informal sector that happens in the global south particularly, but also in the global north, which is unvalued, undervalued. It's brought into focus that there are serious inequalities of wealth, and so on. So I think challenging such a powerful discipline is extremely important, and providing alternatives to it is important. Throwing out economics from it is not going to solve the problem.
Thank you, Bina. I don't know if Julia or Ksenia have a comment on this. I wanted to break the rule and intervene in the debate, not as a moderator, but as somebody who has an opinion.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, Ksenia, please, you go ahead first.
About the
Thank
challenge
you.
of the discipline, and ecological economics that welcomes interdisciplinarity and also recognize the living within the planetary boundaries. What brings in when you welcome other comments and point of view, then we can further go to more to the sustainability that serves us all, because we cannot capture all these things, and Bina said, only through economic lens. So what is important here with starting with, I would say that only challenging these solutions maybe that were brought to us, we can say that from our point of view, in other disciplines, this might be only false solution that we can start with having a discussion and moving forward to the sustainability problem. So challenging these false solutions sometimes.
Yeah, thanks, Ksenia. Julia, you want to say something?
Not at this time. I'll come back in later.
Okay. So I want to take the chance to make a comment now on this debate of, there is some sound, some noise in the background, so please mute your microphones. Thanks. So on this idea of growth and development. So degrowth, when the slogan degrowth was launched, is because in the context of Europe, there is a lot of emphasis in the policy debate on economic growth. And also after, for instance, the financial crisis, there was a lot of emphasis on we need to relaunch growth. And for relaunching growth, we sacrificed everything else. We sacrificed the environment, we sacrificed labor rights, we sacrificed employment, etc. So there is a problem here when I hear, for example, that it's true that, and I'm aware that economists, even mainstream economists, would well accept the critiques to GDP as an indicator. But then the truth is that in the policy arena, in the public debate, in the media, then the focus is always on GDP and there is no critique of it. So then in this sense, degrowth came as a slogan exactly to take distance from this, not because degrowth activists and scholars were obsessed with reducing GDP, but because they wanted to give a kind of a provocative slogan and say, we don't accept this narrative that we need economic growth as a panacea to solve all the problems, and we need something different. So I'm well aware that in the global south, there is a lot more emphasis on the word development more than on economic growth. Although, for instance, in India, there has been decades of debate on how economic growth could be inclusive and green. I think implicitly accepting that growth has not been inclusive or green, at least as much as we wanted. So with development happens a similar phenomenon. I know very well that, for example, in ecological economics, Herman Daly proposed many years ago to look at development, to understand development in qualitative terms, as qualitative improvements. But then the reality in the policy arena by the international organization, etc., is that development is the same of economic growth. And we see this once again with the Sustainable Development Goals. You have a bunch of goals, many of which I could agree with, and we could agree both from a degrowth or ecological economic perspective, but then you have the goal number 8, which is sustain economic growth, with which, of course, the growth would disagree with, and I think at least ecological economic would ask, how can we have growth without the increase of material throughput? So in this sense, I think there is a difference between debates we have in academia. We all agree GDP is not a good indicator of well-being, and debates we have in the public arena, in the policy domain, and so on. But also to find, because this is a dialogue, to discuss about the alliance. So I think one possible point of alliance between ecological economics and degrowth could be that we don't focus on economic growth measured in monetary terms, so by GDP, but we focus on reducing material throughput. I think on this we can all agree. And we focus on what really matters, and is what Bina was saying. So we could say it is the well-being of people, it is education, it is employment, livelihoods, care, for instance, health, etc. I think on this we would agree. Both degrowth and ecological economics scholars and activists would agree that we put this at the center. Then whether this leads to growth or not, well, we can have debates and we can disagree. And how we achieve to this, we can disagree. In fact, none of these communities are homogeneous within themselves. So I think we like this idea of strategic alliance that Matthias put on the table. And I think one thing we could agree upon is this idea that let's put at the center, let's put at the focus also in policymaker, the things that really matter. And let's forget what happened with economic growth. But so now my comment is over, if you want. So I go back to the questions. And I think there was an important question that was asked by someone. And it has to do with a topic we have already discussed, but it has to do with the relationship between the global north and the global south. So we said that degrowth was born in Europe and it applies to Europe. Degrowth considers itself as an ally to other alternatives to development. Ecological economics is more open to the idea of development or of sustainable development and so on. But whatever option you take, of course, there are lots of relationship between the global north and the global south. Ideological in the discourse, but also material. There is a lot of trade and so on. So the question I wanted to read is the following. The question says, the products industrialized countries use are mainly produced in the south. Therefore, the person says, we need to address the problem where it originates, in the Western countries, how they live and consume. And I think this brings us back to the very important and central questions that Bina was asking. What do we produce? How do we produce it? And how do we distribute it? I think hopefully ecological economics and degrowth have something to say about these questions, and hopefully they can collaborate to find answer. I think not aspiring to find a common answer, but at least collaborating in exploring them. So I would like to give back the word to the speakers if they want to comment a little bit on these questions of the relationship between the global north and the global south. Maybe Julia, I don't know if you wanted to say or.
I think I can step in here. I guess one of the things I'm a bit disappointed, and that's why I was sort of not saying anything. I'm a bit disappointed by this discussion because to some extent I would hope that we are further along in this discussion on this understanding of both our alliances and our disagreements and what's strategically useful. And I guess one of the things that I find disappointing is that there's somehow we're not able to articulate, for instance, when I think it was Katya was saying poverty is not monetary and Bina is saying poverty is also monetary. These are not necessarily disagreements. I don't think that Katya believes that poverty doesn't exist as a real thing, but that she believes it should be measured through this multidimensional perspective. So I think that one of the things is maybe we just need to have sort of a clearer, maybe it takes more words to understand that we are in fact on agreement on a lot of things. And there were sort of several instances of this where we're just not able to sort of, we think we're disagreeing, but in fact we are at our basis agreeing. What I find disappointing as well is that we're not moving on to what really needs, we're not talking in a context of urgency, which I think is problematic as well. So I don't necessarily think that we have a lot of academic or other time available to us. I think that we need to be very focused on what we need to do and do it fast and do it effectively. And so I have a lot of sympathy and respect for Manuela's work, but I don't think it's really an open question as to whether or not powerful forces are going to allow, us to get to zero emissions on their own through sort of gentle economic means. I think that question has been answered in the past 3 decades, and it's been answered with a resounding no. So I don't think that we have the luxury of giving the benefit of the doubt to failed perspectives. And one of the failed perspectives, I would say in terms of economics is, does overconsumption come from consumption demand or from producer profit imperatives? And I think I would fall very much on the side of consumer demand is a creation. It does not exist out in nature. It is something that's very much created by producing, by overproduction needing markets. And that's in the global south or the global north. And we've written papers on this. And this is something that can be studied, and also the level of sheer empirical evidence saying that decoupling is just not in the cards is something that we should all accept at this point. This is in the year 2020, this is not something that's open to question anymore. So I think that the point of ecological economics is that we really have to be willing to shut down sectors. We have to come back to this idea of which types of production are not helpful and be willing to focus on shutting down those sectors, and which types of consumption are necessary and allow people to have decent living standards and not be in poverty, not be in deprivation. Those are other things. Those are other types of production and consumption. And so we have to be willing to sort of look at those in very differentiated ways. But that's the mission. And if we don't do that fast, there's nothing left. So I think I wish this discussion would move faster.
Hello. Is it possible for me to say something? Because
no, actually, we've been trying to really keep it to the speakers only, and we only have 8 minutes left. And I have to say, and I'm stepping in here, and hopefully Philly agrees, I actually think Julia made a really, really good point. And perhaps in our last 8 minutes, we could hear from the participants what they see, partly from the view of their field, but what they see, what is the path forward? How do we actually achieve the fundamental changes that are necessary if we want to achieve that just and sustainable future we're talking about? And it would only be like a minute from each person, which I'm not even sure it's worth it. But those who would, I think this, what are the next steps? How do we move forward? What do we do? I think that's the key closing questions that Julia put forward. Any takers on from the panel?
Yeah, very quickly. I enjoyed both interventions, and I agree very much. Let's focus on the common objectives, and there are many, including the desire to make the economic system sustainable and reduce material throughput. That's something that I think we can all definitely agree on. Regarding what Julia was saying, just one small thing. Of course, I agree that market forces by themselves will not go there. That I very much agree, and that's why we need policies. So to come back to Josh's point, there was also a question in the chat about this. Personally, I'm a very top-down guy, and so the way forward is to argue for strong policies that, yes, lead to sustainability and decarbonize, but also take care of the side effects of this process, right? So we need to shut down sectors. That's what we need to do. But we also need to take into consideration that this will have socioeconomic consequences that might be very deep, and we need to address them. And finally, just one last thought-provoking thing about decoupling. It's true that there is no evidence about decoupling. That doesn't mean that it won't happen or it can't happen. It happened in the past for certain specific pollutants in certain regions. So it can happen again if treated in the right way. And if anything, Matthias was mentioning before that there is growing evidence that decoupling, actually there is, I think, growing evidence that decoupling might be possible. The evidence that decoupling is not historically there, there's plenty of it, right? But there is also growing evidence, I believe, in recent years that this might be a possibility.
Good points. So final concluding minutes. Anybody? I see, Ksenia, I just saw your speaker went off. Does that mean you wanna pitch in?
Yeah, I would just like to repeat that the real transformation and real policies must come from the people struggling in all these injustices and reproducing poverty and inequality. And I would say that all this real transformation, how people feel about their way of living, how they relate to the environment, how they want to proceed, what is the development in their own opinion, must come from themselves. So it's from the margins. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Josh. I'll just make two small points. One is, let's bring politics into this because, you know, post-COVID, what you're seeing is reversals of whatever gains on environmental fronts that we're having. You see it in terms of the Environmental Protection Act being hugely diluted in India. You see all the things that are happening in the United States, and I think there is a very difficult moment because the degree of resistance you might have is just having no impact really, because policies are so centralized. You have leaders who are not necessarily listening, so I wanted to mention this. That it's not that we have a real solution, but to say that yes, the political class that we are dealing with across many countries should be a recognized obstacle that we need to be able to confront. The second is, I don't think we can decouple the global north and the global south. And really, there are huge interconnections of all kinds. There are the negative ones of globalization, there are the positive ones. And it doesn't seem to me that simply going back to the era of each country for itself is a very good idea at all. Whether we take research on climate change and you know, heat-resistant seeds, or you're talking about medicines, or about hundreds of other things. So we need to, the alliances have to recognize the responsibilities across the global north and global south, that policies in the global north are going to, even alternatives that you're talking about, will have an impact in the global south, and not necessarily on the rich, but actually on the poor. So we don't really have time to elaborate on this, but I do think that any alliance must take into account the concerns of all countries, really. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks. I could go next. very much agree with Bina's argument about that the delinking of globalization is not the answer. And I think this is one of the weak spots of the degrowth debate so far. We've organized a big conference in Berlin a couple of years ago with refugees co-organized about the links between migration, global south development, and degrowth. And it's very complicated. The issues become much more complex if we want to answer this. The main point, however, I want to close with is that I wholeheartedly agree with Julia's points about the urgency. And I do think there is growing evidence that decoupling is not possible fast enough. And I think this fast enough, we really need to kind of like work out what this means. And there is a lot of need in our general society to create a hegemony, to create a public opinion that backs up both those politicians in power who want to go this way towards a sustainable climate just future, and the activists that are fighting for it. And I think there is still a lot of work to be done to kind of like create the academic backing for these kinds of actions that is still lacking. And I think I would wish that this alliance of degrowth and ecological economics with many others would kind of like provide this backing for radical transformative actions. Thanks.
And our final panelists, we have about, actually it's 9 o'clock right now, but if Katja and let's see, has everybody mentioned about Katja? Do you want a final concluding notes? And Julia?
Yes, so I would like to say that that we should go ahead with the idea of unity in difference. So I think it is important to understand the differences between the different kind of groups shaping together the alliances, and that would help to build these strategic alliances. So, and I would also say that, yes, the issue of urgency that Julia has brought up is very important, and building alliances and bottom-up organizing for it is key. So whether with ecological economics or say with climate justice and Black Lives Matter and other movements. And also I think that this symposium is a great point, one of the spaces for doing it, as the program for the next couple of days shows. So yeah.
And Julia, you had launched this final topic. Do you have any final concluding comments?
No, we're over time.
All right, and I would like to apologize. I have never moderated online like this. I found it far more difficult to pay attention to presentations and readings than I expected. So a little bit inadequate on the moderation job, but thanks everybody for your participation. It was really, really helpful, really useful, and I certainly learned how to do a better job in the future. And Fedi, do you have any final concluding comments? All right, so thanks everybody once again, and yep, we're just over time, so.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you. And thank you, Federico and everybody else, and all the panelists. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.